People often speak about dreams as though they belong to the young. They tell children to dream big. They tell teenagers to choose a career. They tell people in their 20s to take risks. But after a certain age, the language changes. People stop asking, "What do you want to become?" They begin asking, "When are you going to rest?" As though reaching old age means your future has already happened. As though there is nothing left to build, nothing left to discover, nothing left to prove to yourself. But 70-year-old Margaret did not believe that. For most of her life, she had been someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She had spent decades helping other people build their lives. She raised children, she cared for grandchildren, she worked on farms, she sold vegetables when the family needed money, she cooked for weddings, funerals, church gatherings, and neighbors. Everyone knew Margaret could work, but almost no one had ever asked her what she wanted for herself. Then, at 70 years old, after losing almost everything she depended on, Margaret made a decision that surprised her entire family. She started a business. People laughed. Some pitied her. Others warned her that she was too old. But 5 years later, the same grandmother they had expected to spend her remaining years sitting quietly at home was employing 12 people. And the business she started with one cooking pot became one of the most respected enterprises in her town. This is Margaret's story. Margaret grew up in a farming community where girls were taught practical things very early. By 8, she could collect firewood. By 10, she could cook a full meal. By 12, she was helping her mother sell produce at the market. School was important, but survival came first. Margaret loved learning. She was especially good at mathematics. Whenever her mother sold vegetables, Margaret calculated change faster than many adults. Her teacher once told her you should become an accountant. Margaret carried those words for years. But when she was 16, her father became seriously ill. The family could no longer afford school fees. Margaret left Shu. She told herself it would only be temporary. It was not. At 19, she married a young man named Joseph. Joseph was hardworking and kind. He owned a small piece of land and worked as a mechanic. Together, they built a modest home. Then the children came. First Daniel, then Grace, then Samuel, and finally Ruth. Margaret's life became full. There were always clothes to wash, food to prepare, children to discipline, fees to find, crops to tend, illnesses to manage, family problems to solve. For decades, she rarely had time to ask herself what she wanted. Whenever money became tight, Margaret found a way to help. She sold tomatoes. She prepared tea and Mandazi for workers. She cooked meals for people during ceremonies. She made traditional snacks and sold them after church. People always complimented her food. "Margaret, you should open a restaurant." She would laugh. "With what money?" Someone else would say, "Your food is better than what they sell in town." Margaret would wave them away. "I am too busy feeding my own family." Years passed. Her children grew up. Daniel became a driver. Grace trained as a teacher. Samuel moved to the city and found work in a supermarket. Ruth became a nurse. Margaret was proud. She and Joseph had struggled, but all 4 children had become independent adults. When Margaret turned 55, she believed life might finally slow down. Then grandchildren began arriving. Suddenly, the house was full again. Grace left her daughter with Margaret for several years while working in another county. Daniel sometimes brought his sons during school holidays. Ruth worked long shifts and regularly asked Margaret for help. Margaret never complained. She loved her grandchildren. But another decade disappeared into caring for everyone else. Then, when Margaret was 66, Joseph died after a short illness. They had been married for nearly 47 years. His death changed her completely. For months, Margaret woke up and forgot he was gone. She would turn toward his side of the bed, empty. She would prepare tea and nearly pour a second cup. Then remember. Their children visited often at first. The grandchildren filled the house. Neighbors came with food. Church members prayed with her. But eventually, everyone returned to their normal lives. Margaret remained. The house became quiet, too quiet. For the first time since she was a teenager, nobody depended on Margaret every minute of every day. At first, she thought she would enjoy the rest. Instead, she became lonely. She woke up early because her body was used to it. But there was nowhere to rush. She cooked small meal. She swept a house that was already clean. She sat outside and watched people walk past. Some afternoons, she visited friends. Many of them had similar lives. They spoke about children, grandchildren, medication, funerals, and the past. Margaret noticed something. Nobody spoke about the future. One afternoon, her friend Beatrice said, "At our age, we are just waiting." Margaret frowned. Waiting for what? Beatrice laughed. You know, Margaret did know. But she hated the answer. Was that what 70 meant? Waiting? Waiting for children to visit? Waiting for the next illness? Waiting for life to end? Margaret did not want to spend whatever years remained simply remembering the life she had already lived. Then trouble came. Joseph had left some savings behind, but not much. Margaret also received small amounts from her children. At first, it was enough. Then prices increased. Food became more expensive. Electricity increased. Medical costs increased. The roof needed repairs. Margaret began depending more heavily on her children. She hated asking. One month, she called Samuel. "My son, could you send me something for electricity?" Samuel sighed. "Mother, I sent money last week. That was for the medicine. What about Daniel? He said things are difficult. What about Grace?" Margaret became quiet. Samuel continued, "We are all trying, Mother. I know. I have school fees for my children. I understand. I will send something when I can." Margaret thanked him. After the call, she remained seated. It was not Samuel's words that hurt. He was not cruel. He was simply tired. They were all carrying their own responsibilities. Margaret looked around the house. For decades, she had found solutions whenever the family lacked something. Why had she suddenly convinced herself that being 70 meant she could no longer solve problems? The next morning, she went to the market, not to buy food, to observe. She walked slowly between stalls, vegetables, clothes, shoes, household items, cooked food. Then she stopped near a small stand where office workers were buying tea and fried snacks. The line was long. The woman serving them looked overwhelmed. Margaret watched customers waiting. Some left because service was too slow. She looked at the food. Mandazi, boiled eggs, samosas, chapati. Margaret thought, I can make these. Not only make them better. She returned home with an idea. That evening, Grace called. Margaret told her, "I want to start selling breakfast." There was silence. "Breakfast?" "Yes." "Where?" "Near the bus stage." "Mother, why?" "To earn money." Grace laughed slightly. Not mockingly, but with disbelief. "Mother, you are 70. I know my age. You should be resting." "I have rested enough." "What kind of business are you talking about?" "Tea, Mandazi, Chapati, boiled eggs, maybe porridge?" Grace sighed. "Mother, running a food business is difficult. So was raising 4 children. That is different." "How?" Grace had no answer. Later that evening, Grace called her siblings. By the following day, everyone knew. Daniel called. "Mother, is it true?" "Yes." "You want to sell tea by the road?" "I want to sell breakfast." "Why did you not tell us you needed money?" "I have told you." Daniel became quiet. Margaret continued, "I do not want you people fighting over who should send me money every month. We can support you." "I know. Then why do this?" "Because I can." That answer confused them. They understood doing something because you had no choice. They did not understand a 70-year-old woman choosing work because it made her feel alive. Margaret took part of her remaining savings. It was not much. She bought a large cooking pot, a frying pan, plastic cups, a flask, flour, sugar, cooking oil, tea leaves. She borrowed a small table from a neighbor. At 5 in the morning on her first day, Margaret was already awake. She prepared Mandazi. She made tea. She cooked porridge. Then she carried everything to the bus stage with the help of a young neighbor named Brian. Brian was 22 and unemployed. "Grandmother, are you really going to sell all this?" "Yes." "Every day? If people buy?" He laughed. "I think people will buy." The first morning was difficult. Margaret felt nervous. She had sold things before, but never like this. Office workers rushed past. Motorbike riders waited for passengers. Shopkeepers opened their businesses. At first, nobody stopped. Margaret wondered whether her children had been right. Then an elderly man approached. "How much is tea?" Margaret told him. "And Mandazi?" she answered. "Give me 2." He ate standing beside the table. Then he looked at her. "Who made these?" "I did. They are very good." Margaret smiled. He bought 4 more to take home. A motorcycle rider saw him eating and stopped. Then another. Within 2 hours, Margaret had sold almost everything. She returned home exhausted. Her legs hurt, her back hurt. But she felt something she had not felt in years: excitement. The next morning, she returned. Within 3 weeks, people knew her. They began calling the stall Grandma's Breakfast. "Let us eat at Grandma's." "Grandma, keep 2 chapatis for me." "Grandma, your porridge is finished again." Margaret listened. She learned. Customers wanted stronger tea. She adjusted it. Workers requested lunch. She began cooking beans and rice twice a week. Someone asked for packed food. She bought containers. Every evening, Margaret wrote everything in an old notebook. Money spent, money earned, ingredients remaining, customers requesting credit. She remembered the mathematics she had loved as a girl. One afternoon, Brian watched her calculating. "Grandmother, you keep proper accounts." Margaret smiled. "My teacher once said I should become an accountant." "What happened?" "Life." Brian looked at her. "You could still study." Margaret laughed. "Now you are becoming ambitious for me." 6 months after starting, Margaret had more customers than she could manage alone. She hired Brian. Her children were shocked. "You hired someone?" Samuel asked. "Yes." "You pay him?" "Every Friday." Samuel laughed. "Mother, you are becoming a real businesswoman." "I was always a businesswoman. Nobody gave me the title." Margaret saved money. She replaced the borrowed table. Then she bought a small tent. Then plastic chairs. A year later, the owner of a vacant shop near the bus stage offered her a rental space. Margaret hesitated. The rent was high. Moving inside would mean more expenses: water, electricity, furniture, licenses. But staying small would limit her growth. She spoke to her children. For the first time, instead of telling her to stop, they took her seriously. Michael, one of her grandsons, designed a simple sign. Grace helped her understand some paperwork. Daniel found affordable chairs. Samuel contributed money for a refrigerator. Margaret named the business Margaret's Kitchen. On opening day, people filled the small restaurant. There were 12 seats. Everyone was occupied. Margaret stood behind the counter watching. She could barely believe it. At 71 years old, she owned her first formal business. But success did not come without problems. Some days, sales were poor, food spoiled, suppliers increased prices, one worker disappeared with money, a customer refused to pay a large bill. There were mornings when Margaret's knees hurt so badly that she wondered whether her children had been right. One evening, after a terrible day, she told Brian, "Maybe I am too old for this." Brian stared at her. "You cannot say that." "Why?" "You are the one who taught me that problems do not mean stop." Margaret smiled. "So now you're using my own words against me?" "Yes." She laughed. "Very disrespectful. but she returned the next morning. Margaret began making changes. She stopped trying to do everything herself. She trained employees. She created recipes with measurements so food tasted the same, even when she was not cooking. She appointed Brian to manage stock. She hired a young woman named Esther to handle customers and cash. Margaret arrived later in the morning. She rested more. She remained the owner without destroying her health. This was something she had never understood when she was younger. Working hard did not mean doing everything personally. 2 years after opening the restaurant, Margaret received an unexpected request. A local company wanted her to provide lunch for 40 employees, 40 meals every weekday. Margaret thought they had made a mistake. 40? Yes. Every day? Yes. She looked at Brian. He whispered, "Say yes." Margaret turned back. Yes. That contract changed the business. They needed more equipment, more workers, better packaging. Margaret reinvested almost every profit. Within months, Margaret's kitchen was providing meals to 3 offices and 1 private school. Margaret employed 7 people, then 10, then 12. Many were young people who had struggled to find work. Whenever she hired someone, she told them the same thing. "I do not need you to stay here forever. Learn something, save something, build something of your own." One employee, 24-year-old Lucy, eventually opened a small bakery. Another saved enough to return to college. Brian became the restaurant manager. One afternoon, he brought Margaret a document. "What is this?" "A business registration application." "For what?" "My catering company." Margaret stared at him. "You are leaving me?" Brian laughed. "Not yet." Margaret pretended to look offended. "After everything I taught you? That is why I am starting." Margaret smiled. "Good." By the time Margaret turned 75, the woman who once needed to call her children for electricity money had employees depending on her. She had repaired her home, she paid for her own medical needs, she even started putting money into an education fund for her great-grandchildren. But the greatest change was not financial. It was how Margaret saw herself. For years, she had believed her most important achievements were her children. And they were important. But she discovered something difficult to explain. She could love being a mother and still be more than a mother. She could love being a grandmother and still have ambitions. One afternoon, a local women's group invited her to speak. Most of the women were between 50 and 70. Margaret stood before them. A woman asked, "What gave you the courage to start at 70? Margaret thought for a moment. "I did not have courage." The room became quiet. "I had frustration." Everyone laughed. Margaret continued, "I became tired of waiting for people to solve problems I could still solve myself." Another woman asked, "Were you not afraid of failing?" "Of course. What if the business had failed? I would still have been 70. The women laughed again. Margaret smiled. "Listen to me. People use age strangely. If you are 25, they say you have time. If you are 40, they say you should be settled. If you are 60, they ask why you are starting again. If you are 70, they tell you to sit down." She looked across the room. "But time will pass whether you begin or not." Someone nodded. Margaret continued, "If I had listened to everyone who told me I was too old, I would be 75 today with no business." The room became silent. Instead, I am 75 with a business. After the meeting, women surrounded her. One wanted to start selling clothes, another wanted to raise chickens, a retired teacher wanted to offer tutoring, a widow wanted to make soap. Margaret realized her story had become larger than the restaurant. People were not inspired because she had become wealthy. She was not wealthy. They were inspired because she had challenged an assumption many of them had quietly accepted, that their useful years were behind them. Margaret began mentoring older women. She never told them everyone should start a business. She told them something simpler. Do not confuse age with permission. You do not need permission to learn. You do not need permission to begin. You do not need permission to make money. You do not need permission to discover another version of yourself. Her children also changed. They began noticing how often they had treated their mother as fragile simply because of her age. One Christmas, all 4 children gathered at her home. Daniel raised his glass. To our mother, the oldest entrepreneur in the family. Margaret frowned. Oldest? Everyone laughed. Grace said, "When you first told me you wanted to sell breakfast, I thought you were lonely and confused. I remember. I tried to stop you. You did. I was wrong." Margaret smiled. Grace continued, "I thought protecting you meant making your world smaller." Margaret became quiet. That happens to many older people. Samuel nodded. "We thought you had already done everything you needed to do." Margaret looked at her children. "That is because you thought my life was about raising you." Nobody spoke. It was a big part of my life, but it was not the whole life. Ruth reached for her hand. "I understand that now." Margaret smiled. "I had to understand it too." Years earlier, Margaret would have felt selfish saying those words. Now she understood that motherhood did not require the disappearance of the woman who became a mother. A person could spend decades serving family and still have dreams left. One morning, Margaret arrived at the restaurant and found her employees gathered outside. There were balloons, a cake, and a large banner celebrating the 5th anniversary of Margaret's kitchen. Margaret laughed. "You people should be working." Brian stepped forward. "5 years ago, you started with 1 table." Margaret looked around. The restaurant had expanded. The original 12 seats had become 40. A delivery vehicle with the business name stood outside. Workers were preparing meals in the kitchen. Customers filled the tables. Brian continued, "You gave many of us our first jobs." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Do not make me cry before breakfast." Everyone laughed. Then a young employee asked, "Grandma Margaret, if you could speak to yourself at 69, what would you say?" Margaret became thoughtful. She remembered that version of herself, the quiet house, the empty chair where Joseph once sat, the phone calls asking children for money, the feeling that her useful years were ending. She smiled. "I would tell her she is not finished." That sentence became something people repeated. She is not finished. There are people listening to this story who may feel that life has moved ahead without them. Maybe you are 35 and believe you chose the wrong career. Maybe you are 45 and starting after divorce. Maybe you are 55 and your children have finally grown. Maybe you are 65 and retirement feels less like freedom and more like being forgotten. Maybe you are 70, and somewhere inside you is still an idea you have never tried. Age changes many things. Your body may not move as quickly. Your responsibilities may be different. Your risks may need to be calculated more carefully. But age does not automatically erase creativity. It does not erase intelligence. It does not erase purpose. And it certainly does not erase possibility. Margaret did not become successful because 70 was the perfect age to start. She became successful because she started with what she had. 1 pot, 1 table, recipes she already knew, skills she had developed over a lifetime, and the willingness to learn what she did not know. That is something people often forget about older people. They may be beginners in a business, but they are not beginners in life. Margaret understood people. She understood money. She understood waste. She understood persistence. She understood how to survive difficult months. She understood how to wake up when tired and continue. Those were business skills long before anyone called them business skills. Her age was not only a disadvantage, In many ways, it was experience accumulated quietly for 70 years. There is also another lesson in Margaret's story. Sometimes, families love older people so much that they accidentally limit them. Do not work, do not travel, do not try that. You are too old, just rest. Protection can become another kind of cage. Older people deserve care, but they also deserve choice. They deserve the dignity of deciding what kind of life they still want to live. Some want rest, let them rest. Some want to travel, let them travel. Some want to study, let them study. Some want to fall in love again. Some want to volunteer. Some want to start businesses. Some simply want to wake up every morning with something meaningful waiting for them. Do not assume someone has stopped dreaming simply because their hair has turned gray. Margaret spent decades thinking her story had already been written. Daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, widow. But at 70, she added another word. Entrepreneur. And that one decision changed the final chapter of her life. Not because money suddenly made her important. Margaret had always been important. The business simply reminded her of something she had forgotten. She was still capable, still useful, still creative. Still learning, still becoming. At 70 years old, Margaret did not start because she had plenty of time. She started because whatever time remained still belonged to her. And perhaps that is the lesson. You do not need your whole life ahead of you to begin something meaningful. You only need enough life for the next step. Then another, then another. Margaret started with one table. 5 years later, 12 people had jobs because she refused to believe that 70 meant the end. So if there is something you have delayed because you think your time has passed, remember the grandmother who started a business at 70? Your beginning may not look like everyone else's. It may come after children, after loss, after retirement, after disappointment, after decades spent taking care of everyone else. But a late beginning is still a beginning. And sometimes the chapter everyone assumes will be your quietest becomes the chapter where you finally discover what you were capable of all along.